Should we design robots to be highly predictable in their behavior in order to accommodate to the needs of autistic children for predictable environment? To answer this question, we conducted an experimental study that I'll be presenting. My name is Bob Schadenberg and I'm from the University of Twente. Autism spectrum condition, or autism in short, affects each child very differently. However, there are two main features that all autistic individuals have in common. These are difficulties in social interaction and communication, and the presence of restrictive, repetitive behavior and interests. Now, one of the main manifestations of autism is a need for predictable environments, which is also referred to as the insistence of sameness. This is also why many programs for these children are highly structured so that the children know what will happen during the day in order to limit unexpected events. Now, robots might be able to address this need for predictability. Because they're programmable, we can design them to be highly predictable. And this predictability of robots is also a commonly used argument for why robots are promising tools for autism professionals to use. The hypothesis here is that robots could make it easier for autistic children to engage in learning in a robot-assisted intervention and to maintain this engagement. However, robots are not inherently predictable. We need to design them as such. And this involves a lot of decisions and trade-offs. For instance, should we add variations of speech and movement of the robot? Because for typically developing children, we see that this can reduce boredom and increase engagement. Moreover, a highly predictable robot may also not be very useful, as it would perpetuate in repetitive behavior, and it may also not represent the interaction between people, and thus limit the generalization of learnings to human-human interaction. So we might need to introduce a degree of unpredictability to the robot's behavior. To make an informed decision between having a more predictable robot or trading some of the predictability off for other beneficial effects, we conducted an experimental study where we looked at two research questions. The first research question relates to the effect of variance in the robot's behavior on the engagement of the children, and here variance is a way to make the robot more unpredictable. For instance, we implemented variance in all its movements and speech. Now, because autistic children are so different from each other, we also looked at the role of individual differences on the children's engagement in relation to the robot's variance. In our study, autistic children would participate in a robot-assisted activity, which was about learning the basics of emotion recognition. In total, 24 children participated, and these were children with high support needs. The activity consisted of 4 sessions, which conducted on different days. The participants would be divided into one of two conditions. In the high variance condition, we try to maximize the robot's variance in its behavior whilst maintaining a normal interaction. And in the low variance condition, we try to limit it as much as we could. We measured the behavioral engagement of the children by annotating each video recording of each of the sessions. We also annotated their visual attention, so this relates to the locations where the children would look at. And to measure the individual differences, we included the symptom severity, which was measured through the CARS-2, and we measured the intolerance of uncertainty, because we believed that uncertainty was related to unpredictability. And finally, we also included a bespoke scale of their expressive language ability. Now, to analyze all this, we used hierarchical linear modeling. We hypothesized that the effect of high variance would show in later sessions, because initially both robots are unpredictable. But as the children would interact with the robot, they would become more familiar with it, and they start to learn to predict its behavior. But in the high variance condition, this would be more difficult because of all the added variance. However, as you can see in the graph, we found no difference in behavioral engagement over time. However, we did find that those with higher symptom severity also showed less behavioral engagement overall, and those with more expressive language ability also scored higher on behavioral engagement, so they were more engaged. For the intolerance of uncertainty, we found no effect. For visual attention, we again expect that the effect of variance has an effect over time. If we look at how often children would look at the robot, we see that this decreases over time, but that there is no difference between the conditions. However, if we look at all the locations that had nothing to do with the task at hand, we do see that those in a high variance condition increasingly look at such locations. Now, for visual attention, none of the individual differences were significant. So this also means that the differences between the conditions on non-task related locations was independent of any of the individual differences that we measured. In conclusion, it appears that the children continued engaging in the robot-assisted activity, but started to pay less visual attention over time to activity-relevant locations when the robot was less predictable. And instead, the children started to pay more attention to locations that visually did not change, such as the walls or the floor. And ultimately, this could negatively influence learning, in particular for tasks with a strong visual component. We also found that the symptom severity and expressive language ability influence how behaviorally engaged children were in general. The main takeaway from our study is that the predictability of the robot is an important factor in keeping autistic children in a state where learning can occur, and that we should be mindful when trading off predictability in the robot's behavior in favor of other benefits. For more details on our study and on robot predictability, please see our full article, which is freely accessible to everybody.